12 celestial bodies. That is what tablet BM 36609, housed in the British Museum's Mesopotamian collection, allegedly describes in lines 18 through 22 of the Enuma Elish creation epic. Not the planets we know today, not Mercury through Neptune, plus dwarf planets, 11 objects in our solar system, plus one additional body, Nibiru, that appears nowhere in modern astronomical catalogues. The tablet itself is unimpressive to look at. Clay, baked hard, 3,200 years ago in an Assyrian scribe's kiln. Dimensions, 20.3 centimeters by 14.8 centimeters by 2.9 centimeters thick. Weight, approximately 680 grams. Surface carries 213 individual cuneiform signs arranged in 47 lines of Akkadian text. Wedge-shaped impressions made by a reed stylus pressed into soft clay before firing. The script runs right to left, top to bottom, with deliberate spacing between sign groupings that mark word boundaries. Standard Neo-Assyrian writing, standard creation mythology, standard literary format for late Bronze Age Mesopotamia. The physical characteristics of the tablet tell their own story. The clay composition matches other tablets from the Ashurbanipal library in Nineveh, where this copy was originally housed before the library's destruction in 612 BCE. Analysis of the clay matrix reveals it was sourced from the Tigris River Valley, consistent with Assyrian scribal practices. The firing was thorough, but not excessive. The tablet reached temperatures around 800–900 degrees Celsius, sufficient to drive off all moisture and organic material while preserving the fine details of the cuneiform impressions. The stylus marks themselves, when examined under magnification, show the characteristic tapering and depth variation that comes from using cut reed rather than modern tools. Every physical aspect of this tablet screams authenticity. 7th century BCE, standard Mesopotamian literary production. Except according to one interpretation, those 213 signs describe something that should be impossible. A detailed account of planetary collisions that occurred 4 billion years ago, orbital mechanics of a massive planet that returns to the inner solar system every 3,600 years, the arrival of extraterrestrial beings who genetically engineered modern humans and established the first civilization. All of it encoded in what mainstream scholars read as mythological poetry about gods battling for cosmic supremacy. The divergence between those two readings, mythology versus astronomical record, defines one of the most persistent alternative history controversies of the past 50 years. And the divergence begins with a single word, Nibiru. In standard Akkadian, Nibiru means crossing point or ferry. The word appears in astronomical texts as a descriptive term for celestial positions, where orbital paths intersect, particularly the point where Jupiter's path crosses the ecliptic. The term has cognates in other Semitic languages. Hebrew has ma'ava for crossing, or ford. Arabic has mabar with similar meaning. The semantic range is well documented across thousands of texts. When Babylonian astronomers tracked Jupiter's movement through the zodiac, they noted its Nibiru, the point where its path intersected the ecliptic plane, making it a useful reference marker for celestial navigation and calendar calculation. In the Enuma Elish, the term appears in reference to Marduk, the Babylonian chief deity who defeats the chaos goddess Tiamat and establishes cosmic order. The star of Marduk is Nibiru, reads one passage in standard translation, a reference to Jupiter's position in the sky relative to other celestial markers. Astronomical, yes, but observational, descriptive of what ancient Babylonian astronomers could see with naked eyes from temple observatories in Babylon and Uruk. The Mulapin tablets, dated to around 1000 BCE, but preserving observations from earlier periods, provide extensive context for how Babylonian astronomers use the term. These two-tablet compendia catalogue stars, constellations, planetary movements, and seasonal markers used for agricultural and ritual timing. They describe the heliacal rising of various stars, the first appearance of a star in the dawn sky after its period of invisibility. They track the synodic periods of planets, the time between successive similar configurations relative to the Sun, and they repeatedly use Nibiru as a positional descriptor. The star which stands in the south in the middle, Marduk, its Nibiru, reads one passage. Another describes Venus's Nibiru relative to fixed stars. The term functions technically, marking specific celestial configurations used for timekeeping and prediction. Professional astronomers in Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian courts use these tablets as reference works, checking predicted positions against actual observations, adjusting calendar intercalations when stellar markers drifted from expected dates. The work was systematic, empirical, and grounded in what naked eye observers could actually track across months and years of patient sky watching. Zechariah Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-born researcher with a degree in economic history from the University of London, read it differently. In his 1976 book, The 12th Planet, the first in a series that would eventually span 14 volumes and sell millions of copies worldwide, Sitchin argued that Nibiru was not a common noun, but a proper name, the name of a planet, a massive world on a highly elliptical 3,600-year orbit that carries it from the outer reaches of the solar system through the inner planets and back again. According to Sitchin's translation, the Enuma Elish describes this planet's collision with Tiamat, not a goddess, but an actual planet that once orbited between Mars and Jupiter, resulting in the formation of Earth and the asteroid belt from the debris. Half of Tiamat became Earth, knocked into a new orbit closer to the Sun. The other half shattered into fragments forming the asteroid belt. Tiamat's largest moon, Kingu, became Earth's moon, captured during the collision. The cosmic violence described in mythological language was, according to Sitchin, a literal historical record of solar system formation preserved by a civilization that witnessed or learned of these events through extraterrestrial visitors. The methodology was straightforward in its boldness. Sitchin claimed competence in ancient Sumerian and Akkadian languages, despite having no formal training in Assyriology, the academic discipline devoted to Mesopotamian texts. He argued that his fresh perspective, unburdened by academic orthodoxy, allowed him to see what professional scholars missed. Where academics saw religious mythology shaped by centuries of oral tradition and cultural evolution, Sitchin saw eyewitness testimony. Where they saw literary devices and symbolic representation, he saw technical description and historical documentation. Where they saw gods as personified natural forces or cultural constructs, he saw physical beings, the Anunnaki, visitors from another world. The Enuma Elish was not mythology in Sitchin's reading. It was a literal historical and astronomical record preserved by Sumerian civilization and transmitted through Babylonian and Assyrian copies. The gods were not metaphors for natural forces or personifications of celestial bodies. They were physical beings. The Anunnaki, a term appearing throughout Mesopotamian religious texts, were not the pantheon of heaven and earth deities, as standard translations render it. They were extraterrestrial colonizers from Nibiru, visitors who had arrived on Earth hundreds of thousands of years ago and left their mark on human genetics, civilization, and cultural memory. The translation divergence is not subtle. It represents a fundamental disagreement about what the text is and what it's trying to do. Consider the opening lines of Tablet 1 of the Enuma Elish, standard translation by Benjamin Foster, professor of Assyriology at Yale University and translator of numerous Mesopotamian texts. When on high heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, naught but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mumu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. This translation represents the consensus of Assyriological scholarship built on 150 years of linguistic work. Since cuneiform was first deciphered in the mid-19th century, the grammar is straightforward Akkadian, a Semitic language whose structure has been reconstructed through comparison with thousands of texts, ranging from legal documents to mathematical exercises to literary epics. The vocabulary is attested in comprehensive lexicons like the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, a 21-volume reference work compiled over 90 years by dozens of scholars documenting every known Akkadian word, with citations showing usage across multiple contexts. The passage describes primordial conditions before creation. Apsu is fresh water. Tiamat is salt water, the mingling of waters representing the undifferentiated chaos from which ordered cosmos emerges. Mumu is mist or cloud, the interface between the two waters. This is creation cosmology, the separation of heaven and earth from primordial chaos. A literary genre appearing in cultures worldwide, from Greek theogony to Hindu Rigveda to Chinese creation myths. The language is poetic, using parallelism and repetition for emphasis. The imagery is mythological, drawing on natural phenomena, water, mist, the separation of sky and earth, to explain cosmic origins through divine narrative. The function is explanatory of cosmic origins through divine narrative. Why does the world exist as it does? Because Marduk defeated Tiamat and established order from chaos. Why do humans exist? Because Marduk created them from the blood of Kingu to serve the gods. Why is Marduk chief god of Babylon? Because he proved his supremacy through this cosmic victory. The text serves theological, political, and cosmological purposes simultaneously. It justifies Babylon's political dominance by establishing its patron deity's cosmic supremacy. It explains natural phenomena through divine action. It provides a framework for ritual and worship. Sitchin's rendering of similar passages transforms metaphor into engineering specification. Apsu becomes not primordial fresh water, but the sun, the begetter in a literal sense, the source of the solar system. Tiamat becomes not salt water or chaos goddess, but a planet with liquid oceans, an actual world orbiting between Mars and Jupiter in the early solar system. Mumu becomes not mist, but a satellite or smaller planetary body accompanying Tiamat. The commingling of waters becomes the orbital mechanics of the early solar system before planetary positions stabilized through gravitational interactions. What scholars read as literary devices establishing divine genealogy, older gods giving birth to younger ones in succession, representing the emergence of order from chaos through generational conflict. Sitchin reads as chronological formation of planets in their current arrangement. Apsu and Tiamat give birth to Lahmu and Lahamu, who give birth to Ansha and Kisha, who give birth to Anu, who begets Ea, also called Nudimud, who begets Marduk. In standard interpretation, this represents the cosmological hierarchy from primordial elements to sky and earth to the current generation of active gods. In Sitchin's reading, it's the formation sequence of planets. First the sun, then the original planetary configuration, then successive planetary bodies forming through accretion. The problem with this reading is that the tablet provides no support for it in its actual linguistic structure. Akkadian is a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic, with well-documented grammar preserved in thousands of texts ranging from administrative records listing sheep and grain to mathematical problems calculating field areas to love poetry and royal propaganda. The language has verb conjugations indicating tense, aspect, and mood. It has noun cases marking grammatical function. It has prepositions, conjunctions, pronouns, all the apparatus of a fully functional language developed over millennia of use. The grammatical structures used in the Enuma Elish match those in other Akkadian texts. The verbs conjugate normally. The nouns decline properly. The syntax follows standard patterns. When the text says Apsu begot Lahmu and Lahamu, it uses the Akkadian verb aladu, meaning to give birth or beget, conjugated in the preterit, past tense, third person masculine singular. The same verb appears in genealogies, in medical texts describing childbirth, in legal documents recording inheritance through bloodline. It's a normal Akkadian verb used in a normal way to describe one entity producing offspring. Nothing in the grammatical structure suggests this should be read as planetary formation rather than mythological genealogy. The verb for giving birth is a biological verb, not a geological or astronomical one. The text could have used different vocabulary if it intended to describe planetary accretion or orbital mechanics. Akkadian has technical terms for building, forming, shaping, gathering, assembling. But it uses birth metaphors because it's describing divine genealogy, not planetary formation. The Enuma Elish itself exists in multiple copies, 7 tablets, approximately 1,000 lines total when complete, with fragments scattered across the British Museum, the Louvre, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and Yale's Babylonian collection. The tablets come from different periods and locations, some from Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh, 7th century BCE, others from Babylon, 6th century BCE, still others from Assyrian provincial cities. Cross-referencing between copies allows reconstruction of damaged sections and verification of textual readings. When a word is unclear in one tablet, scholars check the same passage in other copies. When signs are damaged, the parallel texts provide verification. This comparative method is standard in textual criticism. Biblical scholars use it to reconstruct Hebrew Bible texts from multiple manuscript traditions. Classical scholars use it for Greek and Latin literature, preserved in medieval copies. The method works because texts get copied, and copies preserve variations that allow reconstruction of earlier versions. The process has been applied to the Enuma Elish exhaustively. Every line has been examined in multiple copies. Every word has been checked against lexicons and concordances. Every grammatical construction has been analyzed according to standard Akkadian grammar. The result is a text that Assyriologists can translate with high confidence. Not perfectly. Some words remain obscure. Some passages are damaged beyond reconstruction. Some metaphors are culturally specific in ways we can't fully recover, but the overall narrative is clear. The grammar is comprehensible. The genre is identifiable as creation mythology comparable to similar texts from other ancient Near Eastern cultures. The language is not ambiguous in ways that would support Sitchin's alternative reading. The genre is not mysterious. Assyriologists read the text the same way for the same reason. Physicists agree on the speed of light. The evidence points in one direction, but linguistic consensus has no authority over popular imagination when the alternative offers cosmic significance. A clay tablet describing ancient battles between gods is interesting to scholars working in specialized academic fields, publishing in journals read by dozens or hundreds of specialists, presenting at conferences attended by a few hundred experts worldwide. It's irrelevant to most people who will never study Mesopotamian literature, never learn cuneiform, never engage with the actual content of these texts beyond perhaps a brief mention in a world history textbook or a documentary about ancient civilizations. A clay tablet describing planetary collisions and alien visitors is a revelation. It suggests that human civilization is not the product of slow cultural evolution, messy, contingent, shaped by environmental pressures and historical accidents and the cumulative innovations of thousands of generations. It suggests instead that human civilization has a clear origin point, a definite cause, an identifiable source. Advanced beings came, they taught, they engineered us. They established the foundations of everything we consider civilized: writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, governance. And they're coming back, completing their 3,600-year orbit, returning to check on their creation, or to reclaim Earth, or to harvest resources, or to judge humanity's progress. The narrative is clean, dramatic, and cosmically significant. That ancient mysteries, the construction of megalithic monuments that seem to require precision we assume ancient people couldn't achieve, the development of mathematical astronomy that appears too sophisticated for cultures we imagine as primitive, the sudden appearance of writing that seems to emerge fully formed without obvious precursors, have a simple explanation. Not the complicated explanations requiring understanding of how cultural innovation actually works, how knowledge accumulates across generations, how human ingenuity finds solutions to practical problems using available resources. Just, aliens helped. One explanation for everything. Simple, satisfying, complete. The evidence for this framework, according to Sitchin and his followers, extends beyond the Enuma Elish to a web of interconnected claims, drawing from multiple Mesopotamian texts and artifacts. The Sumerian King List, a collection of texts recording the rulers of ancient Mesopotamian city-states, includes entries for kings before the Great Flood with reign lengths of 43,200 years or 28,800 years. No mainstream historian interprets these as literal time measurements. They're understood as literary devices emphasizing the antiquity of kingship, similar to Genesis genealogies that assign 900-year lifespans to antediluvian patriarchs like Methuselah and Noah's ancestors. The literary function is recognizable across cultures. The further back in time you go, the more legendary and exceptional the figures become. The numbers grow larger, the achievements more extraordinary, the connection to divine realms more direct. This is how traditional societies establish legitimacy, by connecting current institutions to a mythologized past where gods and humans interacted more directly, where the rules governing ordinary existence were different, where extraordinary things were possible. The ancient kings weren't just powerful, they were semi-divine, living for impossible spans, ruling with supernatural authority. But Sitchin treated the king list numbers as records of actual events, with each year representing one orbital period of Nibiru. By this calculation, 43,200 years equals 12 orbits at 3,600 years per orbit. The mathematics create an appearance of internal consistency that feels compelling if you don't examine the assumptions underlying the calculation. If Nibiru orbits every 3,600 years, and ancient texts record time in Nibiru years rather than Earth years, then impossibly long reign lengths suddenly become plausible. They're just measured in a different unit. The problem is that nothing in the king list suggests it's using any unit other than regular years. The text doesn't specify Nibiru years versus Earth years. The scribes who compiled these lists from earlier sources were tracking succession, establishing legitimacy, preserving royal genealogies, functions that required time measurements their audience could understand, using a time unit based on a planet's orbit that nobody could observe because it only approaches every 3,600 years would defeat the purpose of the text. How would readers verify the chronology? How would scribes coordinate their records if the basic time unit was something nobody living had experienced? The Sumerian king list exists in multiple versions, compiled at different times from different source materials. The variations between versions show how the text evolved. Scribes added rulers, adjusted reign lengths, incorporated different local traditions. This is normal for king lists maintained over centuries by different political centers competing for legitimacy. The process is visible in the textual variations. It's not consistent with a single factual record, preserved, unchanged from the distant past. It's a living document, modified by successive generations for contemporary political purposes. Cylinder seal VA243, held in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, became another cornerstone of the ancient astronaut argument. The seal, dated to approximately 2500 BCE, based on artistic style and archaeological context, shows a seated figure with a star-like symbol hovering nearby. Additional star symbols appear scattered across the carved surface in what looks to untrained eyes like a diagram. The seal is small. Typical cylinder seals from this period measure 2 to 4 centimeters in height and 1 to 2 centimeters in diameter. They were rolled across soft clay to create impressed images used for marking ownership, sealing containers, authorizing documents, and marking property. Sitchin identified this particular seal as a depiction of the solar system, showing 11 known planets plus Nibiru, 12 bodies total, matching the count from his Enuma Elish interpretation. The Sun occupies the center. Planets orbit in their correct sequence. The 12th body, larger than the others, represents Nibiru passing through the inner system. The image becomes proof that Sumerians possessed detailed knowledge of the solar system, including outer planets invisible without telescopes. Professional archaeologists and cuneiform specialists who have examined the seal see something entirely different. The seated figure is a deity or royal figure, identified by standard iconographic markers appearing on dozens of similar seals from the same period. The horned headdress indicating divine status, the formal seated pose denoting authority, the presence of attendant figures typical of royal or divine iconography, The star-like symbol near the figure's head is likely a representation of the deity's celestial association. Gods in Mesopotamian iconography are regularly associated with stars or celestial symbols as markers of their heavenly nature. The stars scattered across the seal face are decorative elements, common motifs in Mesopotamian art, with no astronomical significance beyond general celestial imagery. Mesopotamian cylinder seals from this period regularly incorporate star motifs, crescent moons, rosettes, and other celestial symbols as space-filling decorative elements. The size variations between star symbols reflect artistic composition. Larger stars frame important figures, smaller stars fill empty spaces, creating visual balance within the seal's rectangular layout when rolled out. The arrangement is aesthetic, not orbital. Hundreds of cylinder seals with star decorations exist in museum collections worldwide. The British Museum alone holds thousands. The Louvre has extensive collections. Yale's Babylonian Collection, the Metropolitan Museum, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, universities across Europe and America. If every seal with star motifs represented solar system diagrams, we would have thousands of conflicting astronomical maps. But we don't, because these seals weren't creating astronomical charts. They were marking ownership, sealing contracts, indicating divine protection, showing royal authority. The imagery served social and religious functions, not scientific documentation. None show consistent solar system diagrams with planets in correct orbital arrangement and consistent scaling. The stars appear in different configurations on different seals because they're decorative elements arranged for aesthetic effect, not accurate representations of planetary positions. A seal from Babylon might show 6 stars clustered around a deity. A seal from Ur might show 10 stars scattered across the surface. A seal from Akkad might show 3 large stars and several smaller ones. The variation is artistic, not astronomical. Mesopotamian artisans were not creating star charts. They were depicting divine authority, with stars serving as symbols of heavenly power, rather than specific celestial objects. The Enuma Elish itself provides context that undermines the planetary collision interpretation when examined as a complete text, rather than cherry-picked passages. The text is explicitly mythological in structure and purpose. It explains why Marduk, originally a minor agricultural deity in Sumerian tradition associated with farming and fertility, became chief god of the Babylonian pantheon, supreme over all other deities, including the ancient Sumerian gods like Enlil and Enki, who had been worshipped for millennia before Babylon rose to prominence. The elevation happened for political reasons visible in the historical record. Babylon rose to dominance in Mesopotamia around 1800 BCE under Hammurabi's dynasty, transforming from a relatively minor city into the capital of a territorial empire controlling much of Mesopotamia. When a city achieves political dominance, its patron deity needs comparable elevation in religious hierarchy. You can't have the capital of an empire worshipping a minor god, while conquered cities worship more senior deities. The theological problem requires a theological solution. The Enuma Elish accomplishes this by recasting creation mythology to place Marduk at the center. Older Sumerian creation accounts featured different gods. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, who created humans from clay. Enlil, the god of wind and kingship, who separated heaven and earth. An, the sky god, who headed the Sumerian pantheon. The Babylonian version, composed after Babylon's rise to power, retrofits Marduk into the narrative by having him defeat Tiamat in cosmic combat, establish cosmic order through violent triumph, and create humanity as an act of divine mercy, relieving gods of labor. Suddenly, Marduk is not just a local deity, but the supreme creator, the warrior who defeated chaos, the king of gods whose supremacy cannot be challenged. This political function is transparent in the text's structure. Tablets Suadasi 5 and 6 describe Marduk receiving 50 names from the other gods, each name representing a divine function or cosmic role that Marduk now controls. He is given Ea's name for wisdom. He receives Enlil's name for kingship. He inherits functions from all the major deities, consolidating divine authority into a single figure who conveniently happens to be Babylon's patron god. The text literally describes Marduk absorbing the roles of other gods, making explicit what it's doing, justifying Babylon's political supremacy through theological supremacy. This kind of mythological retrofitting is common in ancient Near Eastern literature. The Hurrian Song of Emergence from northern Mesopotamia and Anatolia tells how younger gods overthrew older ones. The Hittite kingship in heaven describes generational conflict between divine dynasties. The Greek theogony, composed around 700 BCE but preserving older traditions, describes how Zeus and the Olympian gods overthrew the Titans. These texts share narrative structures because they're drawing from common cultural templates that explain cosmic origins and political order through divine struggle. The pattern appears across cultures because it solves common problems. How do you explain why the world is the way it is? How do you justify current power structures as natural and inevitable? How do you integrate different local traditions when political unification brings together peoples who worship different gods? You tell stories about younger gods defeating older ones, about order emerging from chaos through conflict, about cosmic battles that establish the current arrangement. The mythology serves explanatory, political, and integrative functions simultaneously. It's not describing the same historical event independently. It's drawing from shared narrative templates that circulated through trade, conquest, and cultural contact across millennia. The astronomical content in the Enuma Elish, when actually present, reflects observable phenomena available to naked eye observers, rather than telescopic knowledge requiring technology the Sumerians and Babylonians didn't possess. Marduk receives 50 names in the final tablet, Tablet 7, establishing his supremacy over all divine functions through an elaborate litany of epithets and titles. Several names reference celestial positions using the observational vocabulary of Babylonian astronomy. Whose course is glorious, describes Jupiter's movement through the zodiac. Who marks out the constellations, refers to using bright planets as reference markers for tracking seasonal stellar configurations. Who maintains the stars in their paths, describes the regularity of celestial movements used for calendar calculation. This is descriptive astronomy of the kind of practice from Mesopotamian ziggurats, where priests tracked celestial phenomena for religious and practical purposes. Venus's heliacal rising and setting, the first appearance in the dawn sky and last appearance in the evening sky, determined intercalation of months in the lunisolar calendar. Lunar phases determined month boundaries, with the first crescent after new moon marking the start of each month. The positions of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars relative to background stars provided long-term seasonal markers, sophisticated by Bronze Age standards, certainly, accurate within observational limits, demonstrably so, because we can reconstruct ancient planetary positions using modern orbital mechanics and verify that Babylonian observations recorded in texts matched the actual sky configuration for those dates, but limited to what naked eyes could detect from temple observatories across years and decades of patient observation. No outer planets appear in Mesopotamian astronomical texts because they're not visible without optical aid. Uranus, discovered in 1781 by William Herschel using a telescope, was invisible to ancient observers despite being technically bright enough to see with exceptional eyesight under perfect conditions. But it's so faint and moves so slowly that it's indistinguishable from stars without long-term tracking, using instruments more precise than ancient astronomers possessed. Neptune, discovered in 1846 through mathematical prediction, followed by telescopic confirmation, remained completely hidden from ancient observers. It's far too faint to see without optical instruments. Pluto, found in 1930 through systematic photographic search and reclassified as a dwarf planet in 2006, never registered in ancient records because it's thousands of times too faint for naked eye visibility. The multi-pin tablets, Babylonian astronomical compendia, from around 1000 BCE, preserving observations from earlier periods, catalogue constellations, planetary movements, and seasonal markers used for timekeeping and prediction. The planets listed in these texts are Jupiter, called Marduk or White Star; Venus, called Dilbat, or the Bright Queen of Heaven, the most prominent celestial object besides the Sun and Moon; Saturn, called Kayamanu, or the Steady One, notable for its slow movement; Mercury, called Shitu, or the Jumping One, visible briefly at dawn and dusk, difficult to observe because it never strays far from the Sun; Mars, called Salbatanu, or the Red One, distinctive for its color and erratic apparent movement. The visible five, the ones trackable across the sky throughout the year without optical aid, using only patient observation and record-keeping across generations. If Sumerians possessed advanced astronomical knowledge transmitted by extraterrestrial visitors who arrived on a planet from the outer solar system, that knowledge left no trace in their actual astronomical records. The tablets document careful observation over generations, pattern recognition leading to predictive models for lunar eclipses and planetary conjunctions, mathematical techniques for calendar synchronization, ensuring religious festivals occurred at proper seasonal times. Impressive work, foundational to later Greek and Islamic astronomy, but earthbound, developed through human ingenuity working within the constraints of naked eye observation and the mathematical tools available to Bronze Age civilizations. The systematic nature of Babylonian astronomy is visible in the astronomical diaries, continuous records maintained from 747 BCE into the Hellenistic period, documenting nightly observations of the moon's position, planetary positions relative to normal stars, eclipses, weather phenomena, market prices for staples like barley and dates, river levels, historical events. These diaries served both practical purposes, calendar maintenance, agricultural timing, astrological prediction for royal decisions, and contributed to the development of increasingly accurate mathematical models for lunar and planetary motion. By the Seleucid period, After Alexander's conquest in 331 BCE, Babylonian astronomers had developed mathematical astronomy, sophisticated enough to predict lunar eclipses years in advance with accuracy to within a few hours, planetary positions with precision to within a few degrees, optimal times for ritual activities based on lunar phase and planetary configuration. This astronomy was mathematical, predictive, and accurate. It was also entirely geocentric, viewing Earth as the center of cosmic motion with celestial bodies orbiting or circling it, because that's how the sky appears to ground-based observers. And it was bounded by visibility. No mention of Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, or any hypothetical planet beyond Saturn, because none were observable. The question of how Sitchin's interpretation gained such widespread acceptance, despite lacking scholarly support, is more sociological than archaeological, more about the media environment and cultural moment than about the quality of evidence. The 1970s saw an explosion of alternative archaeology narratives riding the wave of counterculture skepticism toward institutional authority. If governments lied about Vietnam, if corporations poisoned environments while denying harm, if scientists built atomic weapons that could end civilization, why trust academics about human origins? Alternative histories offered empowering narratives. You don't need credentials to see truth. Experts are gatekeepers protecting orthodoxy from inconvenient facts. The evidence is hidden but accessible to anyone willing to look with fresh eyes. Part 2. The Hypothesis. 450,000 years ago. That is when Zecharia Sitchin, working from his translations of Sumerian texts, that professional Assyriologists categorically reject as linguistically incompetent, claimed the first Anunnaki landed on Earth. Not thousands of years in the relatively recent past. Not tens of thousands of years during the Upper Paleolithic, when modern humans were creating cave art and sophisticated tools. 450,000 years, a time span that predates anatomically modern Homo sapiens by 250,000 years, encompasses the entire evolution of our species, from archaic hominid ancestors, like Homo heidelbergensis, and exceeds the age of every archaeological site in Mesopotamia by orders of magnitude. This is Middle Pleistocene epoch, marine isotope stage 12, a glacial period with global average temperatures approximately 2 to 3 degrees Celsius cooler than present. Ice sheets covering much of northern Europe and Canada. Sea levels 30 to 40 meters lower than today, due to water locked in continental glaciers. Atmospheric carbon dioxide around 200 parts per million, the lowest levels recorded in ice core data spanning the past 800,000 years. This was a world fundamentally different from the one humans currently inhabit, and recognizably alien even to the humans who existed then. No cities, no agriculture, no metallurgy, no writing, no domesticated animals or crops, no civilization in any form recognizable to modern humans. The archaeological record from that period shows stone tools, Herculean hand axes manufactured by Homo heidelbergensis, the ancestor species to both Neanderthals, who would evolve in Europe and Western Asia, and Homo sapiens, who would evolve in Africa. Brain capacity around 1,250 cubic centimeters, approaching modern human size, but with different cranial architecture and facial structure, characterized by prominent brow ridges, projecting faces, and robust skeletal build. Tool technology essentially unchanged for the previous 500,000 years. Simple bifacial stone implements, functional for butchering game and processing plant materials, but showing no innovation, no regional variation, beyond basic adaptation to local stone quality. No indication of symbolic thought or cultural transmission beyond basic survival techniques passed down through observation and practice. This is the world Sitchin claimed the Anunnaki entered, a planet populated by archaic hominids with no language complex enough to follow engineering instructions, no social organization beyond small bands of perhaps a dozen to 50 individuals practicing mobile foraging across territories that expanded and contracted with climate cycles. No abstract reasoning capacity evident in material culture that remains archaeologically visible. The cognitive gap between these archaic humans and modern humans was substantial. These were not people who could operate mining equipment, follow complex instructions, organize into large labor forces, maintain technological infrastructure across generations. The timeline is precise according to Sitchin's interpretation. The Anunnaki arrived on Earth 445,000 years before present, give or take a few thousand years, depending on which of his books you're reading, and how he calculated backwards from Sumerian king list chronologies that he interpreted literally, despite their obvious literary function. Their home planet Nibiru was experiencing atmospheric degradation. The mechanism is vague in Sitchin's reconstruction, something about solar radiation damaging the upper atmosphere, requiring reflective particles to stabilize climate. The solution required gold particles suspended in the upper atmosphere to reflect solar radiation and stabilize climate through some process that Sitchin never fully explains, but asserts was technologically feasible for a spacefaring civilization. Earth possessed abundant gold deposits in forms that could be mined and processed. The Anunnaki, evaluating Earth as a resource extraction site, established mining operations in southeastern Africa, in regions corresponding to modern Zimbabwe and South Africa, where some of the world's oldest gold mines exist. Though oldest, in this context, means 1000 BCE to 1700 CE in the archaeological record, not 450,000 years ago in Sitchin's chronology, but 250,000 years. According to this timeline, they extracted ore, processed it through means unspecified, and presumably transported it back to Nibiru during periodic close approaches every 1600 years when the planet's highly elliptical orbit brought it into the inner solar system close enough for practical cargo transfer. The logistical requirements are staggering when examined critically. Mining operations require infrastructure, excavations into bedrock or ore bodies, processing facilities to separate gold from waste rock, power generation to operate equipment and provide lighting and ventilation in underground workings, equipment maintenance requiring spare parts and repair capacity, living quarters for workers requiring food, water, waste management, climate control. Even highly automated mining would require supervision, repair capability, and energy sources for 250,000 years. Through ice ages and interglacials, through climate swings that altered vegetation zones and coastlines, and completely restructured ecosystems multiple times, through periods when the African continent was wetter or drier than present, supporting different flora and fauna that appear in fossil records, but leaving no traces of industrial activity. What did Anunnaki workers do during the 3,600-year intervals between Nibiru's returns to the inner solar system? If the planet only approaches close enough for practical transport every 3,600 years, and even that frequency assumes orbital stability that the physics simply doesn't support, the workers would need to survive autonomously for those intervals. That's sufficient time for multiple generations, even if Anunnaki lifespan exceeded human norms by substantial margins. Organizational continuity across that many generations without direct contact with home civilization requires written records, institutional memory preserved through documentation and training, systems for maintaining equipment, and knowledge across personnel turnover, all of which should leave archaeological traces. None exist in the stratigraphic record from any period approaching 450,000 years ago. The labor was difficult, Sitchin asserts, drawing on his reading of texts that describe conflict among the Anunnaki worker class. Around 200,000 years ago, according to Sitchin's reading of texts describing rebellion among the worker class of Anunnaki, passages that Assyriologists read as mythological accounts of gods rebelling against labor assigned by senior deities, a common theme in Mesopotamian literature, reflecting social tensions between ruling classes and workers. The leadership decided on genetic engineering as a solution to the labor problem. Take the existing hominid species on Earth, Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis, depending on which version of Sitchin's timeline you follow and what he thought was the best candidate for the base genome, and upgrade them cognitively and physically. Enhanced intelligence, improved physical capabilities, sufficient cognitive function to follow instructions and operate mining equipment, but not so much intelligence that they would rebel or question their servitude. The result was Homo sapiens, modern humans, created not through gradual evolution over millions of years, but deliberate genetic manipulation performed in something like a laboratory, with Anunnaki DNA spliced into the existing hominid genome to produce a hybrid workforce. This is not fringe speculation added by later interpreters or extrapolated by followers extending Sitchin's ideas. This is Sitchin's core thesis, stated explicitly and defended consistently across his published work, spanning 3 decades and 14 books. He claimed to read Sumerian and Akkadian languages, a claim that professional Assyriologists categorically reject as demonstrably false based on his published translations. He claimed his translations were more accurate than academic scholars because he approached the texts without preconceived mythological frameworks that blind specialists to literal meanings. Where Assyriologists saw gods as mythological beings serving literary and religious functions, he saw physical beings, flesh and blood aliens with technology. Where they saw religious poetry using metaphor and symbolism, he saw technical descriptions of engineering processes and historical events. Where they saw mythology explaining cosmic origins and social hierarchy through divine narrative, he saw historical documentation of actual events preserved by civilizations who either witnessed them directly or learned of them from the extraterrestrial visitors themselves. The methodology rested entirely on linguistic interpretation, the claim that Sitchin could read these texts better than scholars who devoted careers to mastering these languages. Sitchin argued that key Sumerian and Akkadian terms had been mistranslated by mainstream scholars who defaulted to mythological readings instead of considering literal meanings that would reveal the text's true historical and technical content. The term Anunnaki provides the clearest example of how Sitchin's method operated and where it failed. Standard etymology, verified across thousands of textual appearances and confirmed by every professional Assyriologist who works with these languages, breaks Anunnaki down as Sumerian An, heaven, sky, plus Anna, princely, lordly, a rare term but attested in lexicons with clear meaning. Ki, earth of the, a grammatical particle marking association or possession. The composite means princely ones of heaven and earth, or those of royal blood of heaven and earth, a designation for a category of deities distinguished by their cosmic scope and association with both celestial and terrestrial realms. It appears throughout Mesopotamian religious texts as a designation for a category of deities, contrasted with Igigi, another divine class typically associated with younger gods, or those assigned to heavenly duties, while Anunnaki perform earthly functions. The grammatical structure is clear. This is a noun phrase functioning as a collective designation, comparable to how Olympians in Greek mythology designates a specific group of gods as distinct from Titans. Both terms refer to divine classes with different generational, functional, and hierarchical characteristics. The structure appears in other Sumerian compound terms following the same pattern. Lu Kur Ke Gi means people of hostile land, foreigners, enemies, using the same Ki particle. Dumu Munus Egal means daughter of palace, princess, stacking descriptive terms with possessive particles. Gudufo, Dingir, Andon Anna means priest of heavenly gods, using an to modify Dingir, God, and creating a subcategory designation. Sitchin's interpretation was radically different. He read Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came. Not a divine class designation, but an arrival description, an etymological explanation of how these beings reached earth. They came from the sky, therefore they came from space. Therefore this is describing space travelers rather than gods. The grammar doesn't support this reading. Sumerian and Akkadian don't construct sentences this way when describing action or movement. To express the concept, those who came from heaven to earth, in Sumerian, would require different grammatical particles, a conjugated verb form for came, the verb do or gen, depending on nuance, and word order that doesn't appear in the compound Anunnaki. The way the term actually appears in sentences confirms it's a group designation. The Anunnaki, the great gods, appears in opening formulae, establishing which deities are being invoked. The seven judges, the Anunnaki, describes a specific divine council. When the Anunnaki decided, introduces divine decision-making in narrative. These syntactic contexts show Anunnaki functioning as a noun referring to a collective group, not as a phrase describing arrival. It's grammatically equivalent to saying, when the council decided, or the senators gathered, referring to a defined group, not describing how they got there. Professional linguists point out that if Anunnaki really meant those who from heaven to earth came, it would be the only major divine designation in Sumerian literature that's actually a full sentence, rather than a title or category name. Every other divine designation works as a noun. Igigi, heavenly, gods, Anunnaki, if properly understood as princely ones of heaven and earth. Dingir, god, gods, En, lord, Nin, lady. Divine names and categories function grammatically as nouns because that's how language works. You need nouns to refer to entities, and full sentences don't function as names or categories in any natural language. The translation of Dainin.jir or Dingir, different transliteration conventions use different forms, follows similar logical violation of how cuneiform actually functions. In cuneiform script, which is logographic and syllabic, not alphabetic, meaning individual signs can represent entire words, logograms, syllables for phonetic spelling, or grammatical markers, determinatives. This sign combination serves as a determinative before divine names. Determinatives are grammatical markers that aren't pronounced, functioning like capital letters in English or italics in academic writing or genre tags in a library system. They provide grammatical information without contributing to spoken language or adding semantic meaning to the words they modify. Dingir appears before divine names to signal this is a deity. Interpret the following word as a god's name. The same sign can be read as the Sumerian word Dingir, meaning God, when it functions as a word rather than a determinative. Context determines function. Just as there, in English, is an adverb in some contexts and a pronoun in others. But when it precedes a divine name, it's not adding meaning, it's marking grammatical category. Ishtar, Marduk, Enki, Enlil, Inanna, Nana, Utu. Each would have the determinative preceding the name in written text. Dishtar, Demardak, Denki, where the superscript D represents the determinative in modern transliteration conventions. Sitchin translated Dingir as the righteous ones of the blazing rockets, when it appears as a determinative. He treated the determinative as a phrase to be translated literally, breaking it into component signs din, righteous, just, a meaning the sign has in some contexts, and jar, sharp, pointed, another attested meaning in different contexts, then adding interpretive glosses about rockets and spacecraft and blazing that appear nowhere in any lexical source. This is not how cuneiform works according to anyone who can actually read the script. It's not how any professional Assyriologist would approach a determinative. The function is grammatical, not semantic. You don't translate determinatives any more than you translate the capital letter at the beginning of a proper name in English into spoken words. The capital letter tells you this is a name, but you don't pronounce the capitalization separately from the name itself. But the translation served the theory perfectly. If Dingir means righteous ones of the blazing rockets, rather than functioning as a marker, meaning what follows is a god's name, then every god in Mesopotamian literature becomes a rocketeer. Every deity mentioned in every text is automatically associated with spacecraft. Every temple becomes a landing pad where the rocket-riding righteous ones would land. Every religious text becomes documentation of space travel, and every mention of any god is evidence that ancient Mesopotamians were describing technological beings rather than supernatural entities. The interpretive framework transforms mythology wholesale into history, but only by violating the basic linguistic structure of the language at its most fundamental level. Michael Heiser, who holds a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, with specialization in biblical and ancient Near Eastern languages, spent considerable effort documenting these errors in accessible formats. His website, sitchiniswrong.com, provides line-by-line refutation of Sitchin's key translation claims, showing the actual cuneiform signs' standard transliterations, converting cuneiform signs into Roman alphabet equivalents, scholarly translations with citations to published lexicons, and explanations of why Sitchin's readings are grammatically impossible. On the term Anunnaki, Heiser points out that the grammatical particle sequence doesn't support Sitchin's reading. The ki element in Sumerian functions as a locative or possessive particle, meaning of are from the place, or belonging to. It can mark location or association, but it doesn't form relative clauses or verbal constructions of the type Sitchin claims. To say those who came from X to Y in Sumerian requires completely different grammatical structures, using actual verbs like gen, to go, ka, come, conjugated for tense and combined with ablative particles, marking motion from a source, and allative particles marking motion toward a destination. None of that grammatical machinery appears in Anunnaki. The term appears in standardized god lists, catalogues of divine names maintained for teaching scribal students, and for reference in ritual contexts, where it's clearly functioning as a category designation alongside other divine class names. The An-Anum God List, a comprehensive catalogue from the 2nd millennium BCE, lists gods by categories: the Igigi, the Anunnaki, the great gods, Dingir, Gal, the lesser gods, Dingir, Tur. These are taxonomic categories organizing the divine realm, not etymological descriptions of origins or actions. The Nibiru hypothesis itself rests on similar interpretive gymnastics that violate standard linguistic practice. The word Nibiru appears in Akkadian astronomical texts, particularly in the Enuma Elish and the Mul-Apin star catalogues. Standard translation verified across numerous textual contexts is crossing point or ferry, a place where paths cross, where boundaries are traversed, where transitions occur. In astronomical context, it refers to the point where a celestial body's path intersects the ecliptic, the plane of Earth's orbit around the Sun, which from our perspective appears as the Sun's annual path through the zodiac, or where planetary orbits cross relative to each other in the two-dimensional projection we observe from Earth's surface. The Muldoon-Apin tablets, 2 tablets each containing multiple columns of astronomical information compiled around 1000 BCE, but preserving observations extending back centuries, describe the Nibiru of various stars and planets, the crossing points where they become visible above the horizon, where they reach specific positions relative to other celestial markers, where they transit the meridian, where they set below the horizon. It's a positional descriptor in observational astronomy, a way of tracking movement across the sky, using reference points and intersections. The Nibiru of Jupiter describes Jupiter's crossing point relative to the ecliptic, or its position when it passes certain stellar markers. The Nibiru of Venus similarly describes Venus's positional relationships in the observational framework Babylonian astronomers used. This technical usage appears throughout Mesopotamian astronomical texts spanning hundreds of years. The term functions consistently as a common noun with a specific technical meaning in astronomical contexts. It's not treated as a proper name of a specific celestial object, but as a descriptive term applicable to multiple objects' positions. The pattern is consistent across multiple independent text traditions from different cities and different periods: Babylon, Uruk, Nineveh, Assyrian provincial centers, indicating this was standard astronomical vocabulary recognized across Mesopotamian scribal culture. Sitchin made Nibiru a proper name, capitalizing it and treating it as the designation for a specific unknown planet rather than as a common astronomical term describing positional relationships. Nibiru became the planet, the 12th body in the solar system, if you count the sun and moon as the ancient Mesopotamians did, the home of the Anunnaki and the source of the cosmic collision described, according to Sitchin's reading, in the Enuma Elish. The textual evidence for this identification is thin to non-existent when examined honestly. The Enuma Elish includes a passage stating, "The star of Marduk is Nibiru," or more fully, he, Marduk, made Nibiru manifest. He assigned to it his duty, in the context of Marduk establishing cosmic order after defeating Tiamat, but in astronomical context, verified by every Assyriologist who works with these texts. This refers to Jupiter. Marduk was consistently associated with Jupiter in Babylonian astronomy. Jupiter was called the star of Marduk in observational texts, and positions of Jupiter were described in terms of Marduk's location in the sky. The Nibiru reference in this context describes Jupiter's position or its role as a crossing point in the planetary movements observable from Earth's surface. A prominent planet that crosses the ecliptic and serves as a useful reference marker for tracking other celestial positions. Sitchin's reading requires ignoring that well-documented context and treating Nibiru as if it were always and only a reference to a specific undiscovered planet rather than an astronomical term with known technical meaning. It's comparable to taking the English word cardinal in the sentence, "The cardinal appeared in the tree," and insisting it must refer to a Catholic official rather than a red bird, despite contextual clues clearly indicating the ornithological meaning. The ambiguity exists only if you deliberately ignore context that resolves it. The orbit calculation for this hypothetical planet came from numerology rather than astronomy or physics. Sumerian mathematics used a base 60 system rather than the base 10 decimal system we use today. The origin of our 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles, all inherited from Mesopotamian mathematics through Greek astronomy and eventually into modern convention. The number 3,600, which is 60 squared, appears in Sumerian numerical notation as a large unit called Shah, used for counting very large quantities in administrative texts. Sitchin interpreted every appearance of 3,600 or Shah, particularly in the context of divine or cosmic matters, as a reference to Nibiru's orbital period. 3,600 Earth years equals 1 Nibiru year. One orbit of Nibiru around the Sun, while Earth completes 3,600 orbits. This produces elegant symmetry, a neat numerical relationship that feels meaningful, suggesting hidden knowledge encoded in ancient mathematics. But the astronomical mechanics don't work even remotely, as any first-year physics student calculating Keplerian orbits would immediately recognize. Part 3. The orbital mechanics. 3,600 years. That is the orbital period Zecharia Sitchin assigned to Nibiru, based on numerological interpretation of Sumerian mathematics. One complete orbit while Earth completes 3,600 circuits around the Sun. The symmetry is elegant. The mathematics are catastrophic. At that period, Kepler's third law, verified by every planet, moon, asteroid, and comet we've ever tracked with precision sufficient to test it, requires a semi-major axis of approximately 235 astronomical units, where 1 AU is the Earth-Sun distance of approximately 150 million kilometers. That calculation is straightforward and unavoidable. The semi-major axis is the average distance from the Sun over the course of the elliptical orbit, half the distance from perihelion, closest approach, to aphelion, farthest point. That places Nibiru's aphelion at approximately 470 AU when accounting for the eccentricity required to bring it close to Earth, roughly 13 times more distant than Neptune's average distance of 30 AU, deep in the scattered disk region beyond the Kuiper belt, where the Sun appears as a bright star rather than a disk, and temperatures hover just above absolute zero. At that distance, sunlight is 220,000 times fainter than at Earth's distance. Any planet there would be cold, dark, frozen solid if it had a surface, perhaps retaining internal heat if it's a gas giant, but still inhospitable to any life form that could visit Earth without dying from our relatively intense solar radiation and heat. The perihelion, the closest approach that supposedly brings Nibiru into the inner solar system, close enough to interact with Earth and allow the Anunnaki to travel between planets, would need to be approximately 0.3 AU to maintain the 3,600-year period while reaching such extreme distance at aphelion. That places the perihelion inside Venus's orbit at 0.72 AU and dangerously close to Earth's orbit at 1 for AU. The eccentricity of such an orbit is approximately 0.998, producing an orbit so elongated it's nearly parabolic, just barely gravitationally bound to the Sun. That orbit does not exist, not in this solar system, not under the laws of physics that govern planetary motion, not in any stable configuration that could persist for the hundreds of thousands of years Sitchin's timeline requires. The calculation is straightforward application of Kepler's third law, which states that the square of an object's orbital period is proportional to the cube of its semi-major axis. For periods measured in Earth years and distances measured in astronomical units, the relationship simplifies to P2 or A3, where P is period and A is semi-major axis. This is one of the most thoroughly verified relationships in physics, tested on Mercury's 88-day orbit, Venus's 225-day orbit, Mars's 687-day orbit, Jupiter's 12-year orbit, Saturn's 29-year orbit, Uranus's 84-year orbit, Neptune's 165-year orbit, plus thousands of asteroids and dozens of comets with periods ranging from a few years to thousands of years. Plug in 3,600 years for the period. Square it. 12,960,000. Take the cube root. 234.8 AU. That's the average distance from the Sun, the semi-major axis of the elliptical orbit. For a highly eccentric orbit that brings the object close to the Sun while maintaining that average, the math is constraining. If the perihelion is 0.3 AU inside Venus's orbit, then the aphelion must be approximately 469 AU to average 235 AU. The eccentricity is E, Jing, aphelion, plus perihelion, say 469.6, 0.4, 469.6 plus 0.4, average 469.2, 470, 0.998. Objects with eccentricities that high don't remain gravitationally bound for long on astronomical timescales. They're either falling into the Sun on first approach or being ejected into interstellar space after a few orbits at most. The Tisserand parameter, a value that remains roughly constant during gravitational encounters and indicates orbital stability, would place Nibiru in the category of objects that experience rapid dynamical evolution, meaning the orbit changes significantly with each close approach to major planets. Interaction with Jupiter during inner system passages would alter the orbit significantly with each perihelion. Jupiter's gravity dominates the outer solar system dynamics. Anything passing through the region where Jupiter orbits gets gravitationally perturbed unless it's on a very specific trajectory that avoids close approach. After a few orbits, tens of thousands of years maximum, not hundreds of thousands, the planet would either collide with something, most likely Jupiter or the Sun, possibly Earth or Venus if perturbed inward, fragment under tidal stress if it passes too close to a massive body, or get ejected entirely into interstellar space by a gravitational slingshot around Jupiter. None of these outcomes allow for stable presence in the solar system for the 450,000 years Sitchin's timeline requires. The claim requires Nibiru to have maintained this orbit for 450,000 years, according to Sitchin's timeline of Anunnaki presence on Earth. That's 125 complete orbits at 3,600 years each. The probability of such an orbit remaining stable across that many passages through the inner solar system, each time running the gauntlet of gravitational interactions with Venus, whose gravity is weak but not negligible when passing very close. Earth, slightly more massive. Mars, less massive, but potentially closer if the geometries align poorly. And especially Jupiter, the elephant in the room gravitationally. 318 times more massive than Earth and dominating outer solar system dynamics, approaches zero in dynamical simulations. Numerical simulations of similar hypothetical orbits conducted by planetary scientists show lifetimes measured in tens to hundreds of thousands of years maximum before ejection or collision. Not millions of years. Certainly not billions of years if the planet somehow formed with the solar system 4.6 billion years ago and has been on this orbit since then. The solar system is not a static clockwork, but a dynamical system where gravitational interactions between planets cause slow evolution of orbits over millions of years. Planets on stable, nearly circular orbits like Earth and Venus can persist for billions of years. Planets on highly elliptical orbits that repeatedly pass through regions dominated by Jupiter's gravity don't last long. The detection problem is equally damning. A Jupiter-sized planet, and Sitchin's estimates varied, but consistently described Nibiru as massive, typically 3 to 4 times Earth's diameter, which would make it comparable to Neptune or Uranus, if a rock ice world, or Jupiter-sized if a gas giant, would be impossible to miss with modern astronomical surveys. The Wide Field Infrared Survey Explorer, WISE, launched by NASA in December 2009 and operational through February 2011 in its primary mission, mapped the entire sky in infrared wavelengths, specifically designed to detect cool objects that don't reflect much visible light but radiate in infrared from their own heat. WISE was sensitive enough to detect objects with temperatures as low as a few hundred Kelvin, warmer than the cosmic microwave background, but much colder than Earth or Mars, out to hundreds of AU. It found thousands of previously unknown asteroids in the main belt and near-Earth space. It discovered numerous brown dwarfs, failed stars more massive than planets, but not massive enough to sustain hydrogen fusion in the solar neighborhood within a few dozen light years. It catalogued distant galaxies billions of light years away. Its sensitivity allowed detection of objects with temperatures around 100-300 Kelvin, out to distances exceeding 1000 AU, depending on the object's size and temperature. A Jupiter-sized planet at 235 AU average distance will still retain primordial heat from formation even 4.6 billion years after the solar system formed. Gas giants cool slowly, radiating internal energy over billions of years as their interiors slowly contract and convert gravitational potential energy into heat. Jupiter itself emits more energy than it receives from the Sun due to ongoing gravitational contraction. It's still slowly shrinking, converting gravitational energy into heat radiated into space. A larger or more massive planet would be warmer, retaining more internal heat, brighter in infrared emission. Even a cold Neptune-sized planet at 235 AU would be detectable by WISE if it's more than a few hundred kilometers in diameter. At the distances Nibiru supposedly occupies during most of its orbit, 231,470 AU, averaging 235 AU Such an object would shine clearly in WISE data if it existed. It would have been detected, catalogued, analyzed, announced in papers published in refereed journals, and studied extensively within months of the satellite's operation. The WISE data was specifically searched for exactly this kind of object because legitimate astronomers were investigating the possibility of additional planets in the outer solar system based on dynamical evidence from trans-Neptunian object orbits. No such object appeared in WISE data despite thorough searching. The search was systematic and comprehensive, covering the entire sky repeatedly to catch moving objects against the background stars. WISE imaged every part of the sky at least 8 times during its primary mission, with some regions observed dozens of times. Moving objects like asteroids, comets, or hypothetical planets show up by appearing in different positions in different frames, separated by hours, days, or months. The software to detect such moving objects is sophisticated, tested, and effective. WISE found over 34,000 new asteroids, including 135 near-Earth objects that weren't in any prior catalogues. The sensitivity was sufficient that if Nibiru existed anywhere in the claimed orbital configuration, WISE would have detected it easily. The non-detection is not marginal or uncertain. It's definitive. The survey was thorough enough to rule out any Jupiter-sized object, any Neptune-sized object, even any object larger than a few hundred kilometers in diameter within several hundred AU. The absence isn't ignorance, it's knowledge gained through comprehensive searching that came up empty. The Planet 9 hypothesis, proposed by Konstantin Batygin and Michael Brown at Caltech in January 2016, based on peculiar clustering patterns in the orbits of extreme trans-Neptunian objects, ETNOs, with perihelia beyond Neptune and semi-major axes exceeding 250 AU, suggests a real planet might exist at 400 to 800 AU based on dynamical simulations explaining the observed orbital alignment. Planet 9 would have a mass around 5 to 10 times Earth's mass, more like Neptune than Jupiter, an orbital period of 10,000 to 20,000 years, much longer than Nibiru's claimed 3,600 years. And most importantly, the proposed orbit never comes closer than 200 AU to the Sun. It stays in the outer system where detection is extremely difficult, despite dedicated searches using some of the world's most powerful telescopes, including the Subaru telescope on Mauna Kea, and upcoming searches with the Vera Rubin Observatory. Planet 9, if it exists at all, and many planetary scientists remain skeptical, proposing alternative explanations for the ETNO clustering, would be detectable eventually through systematic surveys, but is hard to find because it's faint, slow-moving, and the search space is enormous. You have to search the entire sky, and it might be anywhere. But even Planet 9 in the most optimistic scenarios never enters the inner solar system. It doesn't pass within Earth's orbit every 3,600 years. It stays at distances exceeding 200 AU always, completing its orbit every 10,000, 20,000 years or more, never approaching close enough to be visible to ancient Babylonian astronomers observing with naked eyes. Nibiru, by contrast, supposedly approaches within 0.3 AU, according to Sitchin's framework, closer to the Sun than Earth. At that distance, any planet would be blazingly obvious. Even a cold, dark object with no internal heat source would reflect enormous amounts of sunlight at that proximity. The Sun's intensity at 0.3 AU is 11 times stronger than at Earth's distance. An Earth-sized object at 0.3 AU would appear 11 times brighter than Venus at its brightest. when Venus is at its closest approach to Earth and showing a crescent phase. A Jupiter-sized object would appear even more dramatically, dominating the morning or evening sky depending on its position relative to the Sun. Amateur astronomers with backyard telescopes costing a few $100s can detect main belt asteroids 10–20 kilometers across in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter at distances around 2 to 3 AU, a planet thousands of kilometers in diameter, passing inside Venus's orbit at 0.3 AU, would dominate the sky for weeks or months as it approached perihelion, passed through the inner system, and receded outward. It would be visible to naked eyes, brighter than any star, comparable to or exceeding Venus's brightness. It would be visible in broad daylight under the right conditions, as Venus occasionally is when at its brightest, and observers know where to look. Historical records should document such appearances if they occurred within recorded history. The periodicity of 3,600 years means appearances would occur roughly at 1600 BCE, Late Bronze Age, 2000 CE, our era, and back through history at 3,600-year intervals, 5200 BCE, Early Neolithic, 800 BCE, Mesolithic, and so on. Written records exist for much of this time span in various civilizations, and astronomical records specifically exist for significant portions of it. Chinese oracle bones from the Shang dynasty, dated as early as 1200 BCE, based on archaeological context and carbon dating of associated organic materials, record solar eclipses, comets, novae, sudden brightening of stars, understood modernly as stellar explosions, but recorded phenomenologically as new stars appearing where none were before, and planetary conjunctions with impressive precision, considering they were inscribed on turtle shells and ox scapula using bronze tools. These records are systematic enough that modern astronomers can use them to verify eclipse calculations backward through time. The eclipses recorded in oracle bones match modern calculations of when eclipses were visible from northern China during the Shang period. Babylonian astronomical diaries, systematic observations maintained by temple priests from 747 BCE onward into the Hellenistic period, tracked Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, and Mercury, with accuracy sufficient for modern astronomers to reconstruct ancient planetary positions and verify that Babylonian records match actual sky configurations. The diaries document nightly observations of the moon's position relative to normal stars, stars in the ecliptic region used as reference markers, planetary positions using the same reference frame, eclipses with predictions and observations of actual events, weather phenomena including clouds and precipitation, river levels of the Euphrates, market prices for staples like barley and dates, historical events like king's deaths and military campaigns. These are comprehensive records maintained continuously across centuries. Mayan codices, folded screen books written on bark paper and coated with lime plaster, of which only 4 survived the Spanish conquest and subsequent burning of native books by zealous missionaries, document Venus cycles and eclipse patterns across centuries with extraordinary precision. The Dresden Codex contains Venus tables predicting heliacal risings and settings, first appearance in dawn sky, last appearance in evening sky, over 584-day synodic periods with accuracy to within days. The Maya incorporated Venus observations into their long count calendar, a system counting days from a mythological creation date in 3114 BCE and allowing date keeping across millennia. The calendrical precision is remarkable, The Maya tracked synodic periods of Venus, 583.92 days, eclipse cycles, the Saros period of 223 synodic months, or 6,585.32 days, and solar year length, 365.420 days, versus the modern value of 365.492 days. Medieval European chronicles document celestial phenomena across centuries in monastic records, court histories, and city annals maintained by literate clerics and scribes. Comets, meteors, auroras, eclipses, any unusual sky event was noted because unusual phenomena were interpreted as divine portents or natural wonders requiring documentation. The records are extensive, scattered across monasteries from England to Italy to Byzantium. Halley's Comet appears in these records every 76 years like clockwork. Appearances in 1066 CE, depicted in the Bayeux tapestry commemorating the Norman conquest, 1301 CE, possibly inspiring Giotto's depiction of the Star of Bethlehem, 1456 CE, prompting Pope Calixtus III to pray against the devil, the Turks, and the comet, each separated by 75, 76 years, as Halley's orbital period dictates. Bright comets like the Great Comet of 1680, observed by Isaac Newton, whose observations contributed to his development of orbital mechanics and universal gravitation, or various medieval apparitions, are documented extensively with notes on brightness, position, tail length, duration of visibility. No records mention a recurring massive planet on a 3,600-year cycle appearing in any of these systematic observations spanning multiple civilizations across thousands of years. The omission is significant because the records document far subtler phenomena. Comets visible for weeks, meteors lasting seconds, auroras visible for hours, eclipses lasting minutes. A planet larger than Earth, close enough to be visible to naked eye observers for months at minimum as it approached, passed through perihelion, and receded, would be impossible to miss. The gravitational effects would be equally unmissable in historical data and modern observations. When Neptune was discovered in 1846, its existence was predicted mathematically before telescopic confirmation provided direct visual verification. Astronomers noticed that Uranus's orbit deviated slightly from predictions based on Newton's law of gravitation, considering only the gravitational influence of the Sun, Jupiter, and Saturn. Something was pulling on Uranus, perturbing its orbit in ways that accumulated over decades into measurable discrepancies. Urbain Le Verrier in France and John Couch Adams in England independently calculated where an eighth planet would need to be to produce the observed perturbations. Johann Galle in Berlin found Neptune on September 23, 1846, within 1 degree of Le Verrier's predicted position on his first night of searching. The gravitational signature of a distant planet is detectable through patient observation of known objects being perturbed. Nibiru passing through the inner solar system every 3,600 years would perturb every inner planet's orbit measurably. Earth's orbital period would show variations from the clockwork 365.536 pre-4 days, current value in Julian years, that we observe. The perturbations from a Jupiter mass object passing within 1 AU would alter Earth's orbit enough to shift orbital period by minutes or hours in the decades before and after passage, accumulating over multiple orbits into days of error if ancient calendars were based on a clean orbital period that kept changing. The timing of vernal equinoxes would drift unpredictably rather than following the smooth procession we observe. The 26,000-year cycle caused by Earth's axial wobble under gravitational torque from the Sun and Moon acting on Earth's equatorial bulge. Mars's orbit would show anomalies unexplainable by the gravitational influence of known planets. Mars's orbital period, 686.980 days, is known precisely from centuries of observation. Perturbations caused by Jupiter, Saturn, Venus, and Earth are calculable and match observations. Adding a Jupiter mass object passing through Mars's orbital region every 3,600 years would introduce perturbations large enough to shift Mars's orbital period measurably, alter its eccentricity, change its orbital inclination. None of these effects appear in the centuries of Martian observations recorded since Tycho Brahe made precise naked eye observations in the 1570s. Through modern spacecraft tracking Mars's position to within meters, the asteroid belt would be depleted as close encounters with Nibiru during successive perihelia scattered asteroids into planet-crossing orbits, where they would collide with planets or get ejected by further gravitational encounters, or ejected them directly from the solar system. Gravitational stirring of the asteroid belt by a massive planet passing through or near the belt region every 3,600 years would empty the belt over millions of years. The asteroid families we observe, groups of asteroids with similar orbits and compositions indicating they originated from the same parent body shattered by a collision, would not exist because the dynamical environment would be too chaotic for stable asteroid populations. Venus's nearly circular orbit, eccentricity 0.07, the most circular of any planet, would become disturbed by gravitational interactions with a massive object passing nearby. Venus's orbital stability over millions of years is evidenced by climate models showing surface temperature stability sufficient to maintain sulfuric acid clouds in the atmosphere continuously. Any major orbital variations would alter solar input enough to disrupt the stable hellscape Venus maintains. Mercury's precession, the slow rotation of its orbital axis discovered in the 19th century, anomalous beyond what Newtonian gravity predicts from known planets, and famously explained by Einstein's general relativity as a curved spacetime effect, would show additional unexplained components from gravitational perturbations by Nibiru, the 43 arcseconds per century of perihelion precession that general relativity explains, versus the 575 arcseconds per century explained by Newtonian perturbations from other planets, would have additional unexplained terms varying chaotically as Nibiru's position changed. None of these effects appear in the historical astronomical data or modern measurements collected since precise instruments became available. Planetary orbits follow Newtonian mechanics, with Einstein corrections at the precision required to navigate spacecraft across billions of kilometers. Missions to Mars arrive within minutes of planned times after months-long journeys. Missions to Saturn reach orbital insertion windows, lasting hours after 7-year flights. New Horizons reach Pluto within seconds of planned closest approach after 9 years in flight. The orbital mechanics used for navigation assume only the gravitational influence of the Sun and known planets. Adding a massive undiscovered planet on a periodic close-passing orbit would make this navigation impossible, because the perturbations would cause actual planetary positions to diverge from calculated positions. The stability of those orbits across recorded history rules out massive planet passages through the inner system. Records extending back 3,000 years show planetary positions matching calculations assuming stable orbits under gravitational influence of known bodies. Babylonian astronomical diaries from 747 BCE record planetary positions verifiable with modern orbital mechanics calculations. Jupiter's position in particular is well documented, and calculations of where Jupiter was in the sky on specific dates match Babylonian observations when you account for precession and proper motion of reference stars. This level of agreement wouldn't be possible if gravitational perturbations from an unknown massive body had been stirring the inner solar system. Consider the energetics of a Jupiter mass object traveling at the velocities required for a 3,600-year orbit. At perihelion, closest approach to the Sun at approximately 0.3 AU, according to Sitchin's framework, or whatever distance is needed to bring it through the inner system. Nibiru would be traveling at approximately 40 to 45 kilometers per second, based on conservation of energy and angular momentum. The gravitational potential energy as it falls inward from 470 AU aphelion to 0.3 AU perihelion gets converted to kinetic energy, increasing velocity as it approaches the Sun. At closest approach, that velocity reaches maximum. The object is moving fast, about 3 times Earth's orbital velocity of 30 km/s around the Sun. And it's also gravitationally interacting with everything nearby. The tidal forces it exerts on Earth will be substantial, not enough to rip the planet apart through tidal disruption. Earth survived forming in a disk full of large objects and colliding with a Mars-sized impactor, the leading hypothesis for the Moon's formation. So it's structurally robust against tidal stress that doesn't exceed certain thresholds, but substantial enough to cause measurable effects if the E approaches close enough. Ocean tides would increase dramatically beyond the familiar meter-scale variations from lunar and solar gravitational pull we experience daily. The tidal force is proportional to mass divided by distance cubed. Closer encounters produce much stronger tides even if the perturbing mass is smaller. The Moon, despite being much less massive than Jupiter, causes stronger tides than the Sun does because it's so much closer. 384 on 400 km average versus 150 million km. A Jupiter mass object at 0.3 AU, 45 million km, still far away but closer than the Sun, would exert tidal forces comparable to the Moon's, despite being further away, because it's so much more massive. Jupiter is 318 times Earth's mass. The Moon is 181 Earth's mass. The exact tidal amplitude depends on the geometry, how close the closest approach is, whether it passes directly between Earth and Sun or off to the side, how long it spends in proximity. But tides potentially tens of meters high are plausible if the approach is within 0.1, 0.3 AU, depending on specifics. These would not be ocean tides in the sense of gentle water level rise. They would be catastrophic global flooding, as ocean water piled up on the side, facing the perturber and opposite side. Tidal forces create 2 bulges, one toward and one away from the perturbing mass, as anyone familiar with how Moon causes tides understands. Coastal civilizations would be obliterated. Islands would be submerged. Continental interiors far from oceans would be spared. But any city within 100 kilometers of coastlines, which is most cities through history because ocean access facilitates trade, would experience devastation. Earthquake frequency would spike dramatically as tidal stress on Earth's crust flexed the lithosphere, triggering earthquakes along fault zones under strain. Earth's crust floats on the mantle, and tidal forces from external bodies deform the entire planet slightly. Earth isn't rigid but elastic enough to deform tens of centimeters under lunar tidal stress, though we don't notice because the ground and oceans deform together. Much stronger tidal forces from a close passage would flex the crust more substantially, potentially triggering earthquakes at fault zones already near their failure threshold. The effect would be global, fault zones worldwide experiencing stress increases simultaneously. Volcanic activity might increase from pressure changes in magma chambers as tidal deformation change stress regimes in the crust. Magma chambers are already under pressure from buoyant magma trying to rise. Tidal stress adding additional pressure changes could trigger eruptions of volcanoes close to erupting anyway. The effect would not be universal. Dormant volcanoes wouldn't suddenly become active, but active or near-active systems might erupt during a close passage. These are testable predictions if taken seriously. The geological record preserves evidence of past catastrophes through multiple independent proxies. Ice cores contain ash layers from volcanic eruptions. Sulfate spikes in ice chemistry indicate major eruptions, and ash particles can sometimes be traced to specific volcanoes through chemical fingerprinting of glass shards. Sediment cores from ocean basins and lakes show tsunami deposits, chaotic layers of jumbled sediment containing marine organisms, and sorted grain sizes indicating deposition by high-energy water flows, distinctly different from normal, slowly accumulated sediment layers. Tree rings record climate disruptions, years with abnormally narrow rings indicating cold growing seasons, which often follow major volcanic eruptions that inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere, reflecting sunlight and cooling climate globally for 1 to 3 years. None of these records show periodic catastrophes on 3,600-year intervals extending into the past. The ice core record from Antarctica extends back 800,000 years in the Epica Dome Sea core, preserving volcanic eruptions, climate cycles, atmospheric composition changes across that entire span. Volcanic eruptions appear at irregular intervals. Major eruptions are random in time, not periodic. Climate changes follow Milankovitch cycles, variations in Earth's orbit, and axial tilt causing ice age cycles, with periods of 41,000 years, 100,000 years, and 23,000 years. No 3,600-year cycle appears in climate data. Sediment cores from the Black Sea, Mediterranean, Pacific, Atlantic. Document regional and global events, tsunami deposits from earthquakes, flood layers from climate-driven river discharge changes, ash layers from volcanic eruptions. The chronologies are irregular, not periodic. Some periods see clusters of events, like the period 12,000, 11,000 years ago, when rapid climate change at the end of the Ice Age triggered floods, sea level rise, and environmental disruptions. But there's no 3,600-year periodicity in the frequency or magnitude of geological catastrophes. Tree ring chronologies extend back 12,000 years in some regions using overlapping sequences from living trees, dead trees, archaeological wood, and subfossil logs preserved in bogs and rivers. The width of each annual ring reflects growing conditions, wide rings in good years, narrow rings in bad years. Volcanic eruptions produce narrow rings globally or regionally the following year when sulfate aerosols cool climate and shorten growing seasons. These appear irregularly. 1628 BCE, Santorini eruption. 536 CE, unknown eruption, possibly Ilopango in El Salvador. 1815 CE, Tambora in Indonesia. The year without a summer in 1816, and many others. No 3,600-year cycle appears. The flood mythology that Sitchin connected to Nibiru's passages appears in many cultures, but with dates and details that don't align with each other or with any 3,600-year cycle. The biblical flood in Genesis, placed in the distant past of Hebrew tradition, but impossible to date From the text alone, biblical chronologies places somewhere between 4000 3000 BCE, depending on interpretation. The Mesopotamian flood in the Atrahasis epic and the Gilgamesh epic, where the flood story appears as an episode in Gilgamesh's quest for immortality. Plato's Atlantis story, set 9,000 years before Plato's time according to the dialogue, so roughly 11,400 years ago from today, describing an island civilization destroyed by earthquake and flood. Various indigenous flood legends from Australia, Pacific Islands, Americas. These stories reflect different events at different times, or more likely, they reflect common human experience of regional flooding in river valleys and coastal areas where early civilizations developed. Rivers flood regularly. The Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, Indus, Yellow River all flood seasonally or episodically, sometimes catastrophically, when unusual weather patterns deliver exceptional rainfall or rapid snowmelt. Coastal areas experience tsunami from earthquakes and submarine landslides. Storm surges from hurricanes and cyclones inundate low-lying coasts. These flood events are dramatic enough to enter cultural memory, transmitted orally across generations, eventually recorded in writing when writing develops. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by William Ryan and Walter Pittman in 1997, based on sediment cores and seismic profiles from the Black Sea floor, suggests one possible real event that might have inspired flood mythology in the Mediterranean region. According to this hypothesis, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake during the last glacial period, isolated from the Mediterranean and sitting at a level about 100 meters below current sea level. As glaciers melted and global sea level rose after 15,000 BCE, the Mediterranean rose until around 5,600 BCE. It breached the Bosporus sill and poured into the Black Sea basin in a catastrophic flood. The inundation would have raised Black Sea level by meters per day, flooding coastal settlements and creating the current marine environment that dominates the Black Sea today, evidenced by a sharp transition in sediment cores from freshwater to marine species around 7,600 years ago. This event is roughly datable through multiple methods: sediment cores showing the freshwater to saltwater transition, and associated radiocarbon dates on shells and organic material, seismic profiles showing submerged shorelines at depths, indicating when the flooding occurred based on sea level curves, archaeological evidence of coastal settlements that were abandoned in the early 6th millennium BCE, but that's 5,600 BCE, approximately 7,600 years ago, not aligned with any 3,600-year cycle counting from present. It's one event, not a recurring cycle, and it's regional to the Black Sea basin, not global. Other flood myths traced to local events. The Tigris and Euphrates flood catastrophically when unusual weather patterns bring heavy rains to the mountains where they originate, combined with spring snowmelt. The 1954 flood in Iraq inundated vast areas, destroyed villages, disrupted agriculture. Similar floods occurred in antiquity, recorded in texts like the Sumerian Eridu Genesis and Akkadian Atrahasis as historical floods that destroyed settlements and killed populations. Coastal tsunami from submarine earthquakes appear in oral traditions from Pacific Rim cultures. Japanese tsunami legends, Pacific Island stories of waves that destroyed villages, Native American oral traditions from the Pacific Northwest describing great waves that came from the ocean. Monsoons flood river valleys across Asia when seasonal rains arrive with unusual intensity. Storm surges from tropical cyclones inundate coastal areas regularly. All these events happen at irregular intervals, not on 3,600-year cycles, and they're local or regional, not global. The flood stories are varied in their details because they're describing different floods in different places at different times. Or they're universal because flooding is a common natural disaster that every river valley and coastal civilization experiences at some point, making flood stories as ubiquitous as fire stories or earthquake stories or drought stories. They don't require a planetary catastrophe to explain. Regional natural disasters are sufficient, and evidence. Sitchin's framework requires not just one close approach, but 125 of them over the claimed 450,000-year Anunnaki presence on Earth. Each passage brings Nibiru within the orbit of Venus at 0.72 AU or closer. Each passage gravitationally stirs the inner solar system, perturbing planetary orbits, potentially triggering geological catastrophes on Earth through tidal stress. Each passage should leave geological signatures of global-scale disruption, iridium anomalies from material deposited if Nibiru has comet-like properties, impact craters if it brings along debris that strikes Earth, climate disruptions visible in ice cores and sediment cores, extinction events visible in the fossil record. The sedimentary record shows nothing of the sort. Earth's geological history is violent. Asteroid impacts like the Chicxulub impact 66 million years ago that contributed to or caused the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction. Supervolcano eruptions like the Toba eruption 74,000 years ago that deposited ash across Asia and may have caused a volcanic winter. Ice ages that covered continents with ice sheets kilometers thick. Magnetic field reversals that occurred irregularly through geological history. But the violence is chaotic, not periodic. No 3,600-year pattern appears in any geological proxy data spanning the relevant timescales. The atmospheric evidence from ice cores is particularly clear and constraining. Ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland preserve atmospheric composition going back 800,000 years in the longest Antarctic cores, Epica Dome C, drilled between 1996 and 2004, reaching a depth of 3,270 meters and recovering ice from 800,000 years ago based on ice flow models and volcanic marker layers dated by correlation with marine sediment cores. Annual snow accumulation in central Antarctica compresses into ice over centuries, trapping small bubbles of air that preserve atmospheric samples from the time the snow fell. Analyzing these bubbles reveals carbon dioxide levels, methane concentrations, oxygen and nitrogen isotope ratios, trapped air bubbles, trace gases. The data shows orbital forcing from Milankovitch cycles, variations in Earth's axial tilt, obliquity, precession of the equinoxes, and orbital eccentricity that alter the distribution and intensity of solar radiation, reaching different latitudes across seasons, driving ice age cycles with periods of approximately 41,000 years in obliquity variation, 23,000 years in precession, and 100,000 years in eccentricity. Carbon dioxide levels vary between 180 ppm during glacial maxima, when ice sheets are extensive and cold temperatures reduce ocean outgassing and increase CO2 solubility. Plus, reduced vegetation coverage means less atmospheric CO2 production from plant respiration, and 280 ppm during interglacials, like the past 10,000 years before Industrial Revolution. The CO2 variations track temperature changes determined independently from oxygen isotope ratios in the ice, which reflect temperature at the time the water vapor condensed into snow. Methane levels track between 400 ppb during glacials and 700 ppb during interglacials, with methane sources being wetlands, which expand during warm periods and emit methane from anaerobic decomposition and natural gas seeps. The correlations are tight, reproducible across different ice cores from different locations, and consistent with our understanding of how carbon dioxide and methane cycle between atmosphere, ocean, and biosphere under different climate states. It shows volcanic eruptions depositing sulfur and ash, spikes in sulfate concentration indicating major volcanic eruptions, with the largest spikes corresponding to eruptions like Toba 74,000 years ago, Tambora 1815 CE, and dozens of smaller eruptions across the 800,000-year record. The sulfate spikes are sharp, lasting 1 to 3 years as sulfate aerosols settle out of the stratosphere, then returning to background levels. They appear irregularly, not periodically. Volcanism is driven by tectonic processes and magma chamber evolution that don't operate on periodic cycles. It shows the transitions between glacial and interglacial periods, driven by orbital forcing. Gradual changes over thousands of years as ice sheets grow and retreat, ocean circulation patterns shift, vegetation zones migrate, atmospheric composition adjusts to new temperature regimes. The transitions follow Milankovitch, forcing with lags and feedbacks, visible in the data. The 100,000-year cycle dominates the past million years. The Middle Pleistocene transition, around 1 million years ago, shifted dominant periodicity from 41,000 years to 100,000 years, for reasons still debated, possibly related to ice sheet dynamics or carbon cycle changes. It shows no evidence of regular catastrophic disruptions that would accompany repeated close encounters with a massive planet every 3,600 years. No 3,600-year periodicity in volcanic activity, no 3,600-year climate cycles, no 3,600-year variations in atmospheric composition beyond what orbital forcing and chaotic climate variability produce. If gravitational perturbations or tidal heating or electromagnetic interactions or any other mechanism associated with Nibiru passages caused repeated catastrophes, those catastrophes should appear as spikes in multiple ice core proxies every 3,600 years. Sharp climate changes, volcanic activity spikes, atmospheric chemistry anomalies. None appear. The ice core record is independently verified through multiple methods. Volcanic ash layers can sometimes be chemically fingerprinted to specific eruptions. The Toba ash layer at 74,000 years ago is identifiable in ice cores, marine sediment cores, and terrestrial ash deposits across Asia, allowing correlation between different archives. Orbital cycles predicted by astronomical calculations match the cyclicity seen in ice core data, confirming the chronology. Comparison between Antarctic and Greenland ice cores shows synchronous changes in global climate, like the abrupt warming at the end of the Younger Dryas, 11,700 years ago, visible in both hemispheres, and hemispheric differences, like the bipolar seesaw, where Antarctic warming precedes Greenland warming during deglaciations, attributed to changes in ocean circulation. The ice core data is among the most detailed paleoclimate archives available, and it decisively rules out any mechanism that would cause periodic global catastrophes on 3,600-year intervals. Whatever killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, asteroid impact plus massive volcanism in India's Deccan Traps, whatever caused the eruption of Toba 74,000 years ago, magma chamber evolution in the Sumatran volcanic arc, whatever triggered ice ages over the past 2.6 million years, Milankovitch orbital forcing modulating solar radiation, none of it operates on 3,600-year cycles. What about the possibility that Nibiru exists but doesn't follow the 3,600-year orbit Sitchin proposed? Maybe the period is different, the approach less close, the object smaller than claimed, the orbit less eccentric. That retreats from testable predictions into vagueness where the hypothesis becomes unfalsifiable. If any orbital parameter can be adjusted arbitrarily to avoid contradiction with observation, then the hypothesis explains everything by explaining nothing specifically enough to test. But it's worth examining. Various Planet 9 proposals suggest objects at 400 to 1000 AU with periods of 10,000 to 75,000 years, masses of 5 to 10 Earth masses, not Jupiter mass, perihelia always exceeding 200 AU, never coming into the inner system, eccentricities around 0.2 to 0.4, moderately elliptical but not too extreme. Those orbital parameters are plausible dynamically. An object that distant, moving that slowly on a moderately elliptical orbit might remain stable for billions of years if it formed in the outer solar system or was captured early in solar system history. Such an object might remain undetected despite searches because it's faint, slow-moving, and the search space is enormous. You have to search the entire sky. It could be anywhere. It's moving slowly enough that you need observations separated by months or years to detect motion against background stars, and it's faint enough that you need large telescopes and long exposure times. The ongoing searches with Subaru and upcoming searches with Vera Rubin Observatory's Legacy Survey of Space and Time, LSST, will eventually either find it or rule it out conclusively. But that hypothetical Planet 9, if it exists at all, which remains uncertain, doesn't match Sitchin's framework. He needed close approaches to explain Anunnaki visits. He needed regular returns on a timetable short enough that ancient civilizations could record multiple appearances. He needed visibility to ancient observers to explain how Sumerians knew about it without telescopes. A distant planet that never enters the inner system and takes 10,000, 75,000 years per orbit doesn't accomplish any of that. It's not visible to naked eyes, not close enough for easy space travel, even with advanced technology, not returning on timescales relevant to human civilization. The mathematical constraints are absolute in a way that makes the hypothesis physically untenable regardless of translation questions or cultural interpretations. Kepler's laws aren't suggestions subject to reinterpretation. They're relationships derived from Newtonian gravity and verified across every gravitational system we've observed from binary stars, where both stars orbit their common center of mass, following elliptical orbits with periods related to the cubed semi-major axis, exactly as Kepler's third law specifies. Two satellite orbits around Jupiter, where dozens of moons from tiny irregular captured asteroids to giant Ganymede all follow Keplerian orbits. Two exoplanets discovered around other stars, where transit timing and radial velocity measurements confirm orbital periods match Kepler's laws using the star's mass instead of the sun's. You can't have a 3,600-year period without the corresponding semi-major axis of 235 AU. That's not interpretation. It's arithmetic from a law more thoroughly tested than nearly any other relationship in physics. You can't have an orbit bringing an object to 0.3 AU perihelion while also taking it to 470 AU aphelion without extreme eccentricity of 0.998. The math doesn't allow intermediate options. If perihelion is less than 1 AU, which it must be to interact with Earth according to Sitchin, an aphelion is around 470 AU. which it must be to average 255 AU semi-major axis for a 3,600-year period, then eccentricity is necessarily extreme, and you can't maintain that orbit for hundreds of thousands of years without it degrading through gravitational interactions that accumulate over multiple passages. Orbital dynamics isn't guesswork. It's the subject of centuries of study using increasingly precise observations and increasingly sophisticated modeling. The dynamical stability of hypothetical orbits can be tested through numerical integration, where you start with specific initial conditions and calculate forward through time using Newton's laws, or Einstein's if precision requires general relativity, accounting for gravitational interactions from all major planets. These simulations show whether orbits remain stable or evolve chaotically until ejection or collision occurs. Simulations of orbits resembling Sitchin's Nibiru show rapid instability. The perihelion is too close. Passing through the inner system guarantees close approaches to Jupiter at unpredictable intervals, depending on where Jupiter happens to be in its 12-year orbit when Nibiru passes through. A single close approach to Jupiter can change the orbit substantially. Repeated passages over thousands of years guarantee that eventually a close approach will occur that ejects Nibiru, or sends it crashing into the Sun, or alters the orbit so drastically that the 3,600-year period disappears. The Kozai mechanism, a dynamical effect where the eccentricity and inclination of an orbit can trade off, with eccentricity increasing while inclination decreases or vice versa, on timescales determined by the orbital periods involved, would affect Nibiru's orbit over tens of thousands of years, potentially driving the eccentricity even higher until the perihelion entered the Sun's atmosphere or the orbit became completely unbound. This mechanism is well studied in asteroid dynamics, where it affects asteroids on inclined orbits, and exoplanet systems, where it explains some of the hot Jupiters found very close to their stars, thought to have migrated inward through Kozai cycles plus tidal friction. And you can't hide a Jupiter-mass planet in an orbit that brings it into the inner solar system from modern astronomical surveys that have catalogued millions of much smaller, much dimmer, much more distant objects. The sensitivity of surveys like WISE is understood precisely because the instruments are calibrated against known objects, brown dwarfs, asteroids, distant galaxies, whose distances and temperatures are known from other observations. The sensitivity curves as a function of distance, size, and temperature are well characterized. A Jupiter-sized planet anywhere within 500 AU would exceed detection thresholds by enormous margins. The mathematical and observational evidence doesn't care about narrative appeal, cultural influence, or commercial success of books and television shows. Either a planet exists with specific properties, or it doesn't. The properties dictate observable consequences, gravitational perturbations of known planets, infrared emission detectable by sensitive telescopes, historical records of appearances when it passes close enough to see. The observations test the hypothesis. The results are negative across every test, not ambiguous, not dependent on interpretation, not controversial among specialists, definitively negative. Through a day 7,600 years. That's long enough for empires to rise and fall, languages to evolve beyond mutual comprehension, entire civilizations to fade into archaeological layers. But it's not long enough for a massive planet to hide from telescopes, gravitational perturbation analysis, and infrared surveys that have mapped objects throughout the solar system down to rocky fragments kilometers across orbiting in the main asteroid belt, or the Kuiper belt, or the scattered disk. The math remains unambiguous, regardless of how many books sell or how many documentaries air. A 3,600-year orbit with the properties Sitchin described is incompatible with the solar system we observe, measure, and navigate through, with spacecraft that reach their destinations precisely when calculations predict, because those calculations account for all gravitational influences that actually exist. Adding Nibiru would make every mission to Mars miss its landing site by hundreds or thousands of kilometers, make predictions of planetary positions wrong by degrees, make eclipse calculations fail by hours or days. None of that happens. The predictions work. The spacecraft arrive. The eclipses occur when calculated. And that precision is only possible because there is no massive, undiscovered planet perturbing orbits